Jesus feeding the crowd of 5,000 plus, only men were numbered there, is one of these stories that rightly captures the imagination of the faithful each new time that we listen in. This is a story that reminds us what is possible when God is involved. And it reminds us that if we will notice what we have, God will turn it into more than we can imagine. Now, of course, that's a nice way to button it up and to distill a nice little moral from a story like that, but it didn't start out quite as tidy as a moral. Imagine the situation. Jesus is exhausted. His apprentices are exhausted, and they need to sneak away from the demands of their public life to get a moment's rest. But word gets out that they are near, and the crowd ensures that there will be no rest for the weary this day. Instead, Jesus teaches and heals the people, and as the day grows long, the natural order of things kicks in. That is, the massive crowd gets hungry. The disciples try to manage what will surely be a crisis or a riot on their hands if left unattended. They encourage Jesus, send them away, make it their own problem to figure out. But Jesus manages the matter differently. He tells his disciples, you figure it out. You feed them. With that weight on their shoulders, who wouldn't let out their cry of desperation? But we have so little. We've only got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. It seems like a common problem for faithful church folks, doesn't it? We've been asked to do such big things, but it seems that we have so little. Jesus, though, doesn't give a whole lot of time to entertaining that thought. In wisdom, he turns all of that anxious energy of his disciples to a much more productive task. He tells them, organize the people into small groups of 50. And the chaos of that hungry crowd as they become organized takes shape and some order. And the sea of people becomes something manageable. And those who are no longer a part of a crowd but are in a small group can begin to notice and hear those individuals closest to them. And then Jesus did the thing that we do every month as we gather at this table. He took what he had, as meager as it seemed, he gave thanks to God, broke it, and then he gave it away. Or should I say, he gave it to his disciples, who then served each of these groups. The people ate, they were full, and there were leftovers to spare. Now, this is a story of abundance, and it's no wonder that it still has the power to spark our imaginations to consider possibilities beyond what meets the eye. However, we often assume that this is a story about a miracle and bread that just multiplies miraculously, magically, you might say. But Parker Palmer, the great Quaker author and educator, fills in the gaps of this story a little bit differently than that. He recounts this in a lovely little book he wrote called The Active Life, and I would commend it to anyone. For Palmer, it isn't magic or miracle that multiplies the bread. In fact, in that chapter where he speaks on this passage, he even reminds us that when Jesus was in the wilderness, he resisted the temptation to create miraculous bread when that would have been the easy thing to do. That is not to say, though, that Palmer sees this story as any less transformational than miracle or magic bread. For him, this is a story of Jesus overcoming the people's scarcity mindset and the scarcity mindset of his disciples, too. A way we might frame what Jesus is up to in this story is he's reframing the outlook of the people from one of scarcity to abundance. That is an important shift. In our story, scarcity has some far-reaching consequences. The disciples, you remember, they didn't have a solution, or they didn't think they had a solution. So instead, they said, let's disband the people, send them their separate ways. They can go buy food and find lodging for themselves, the disciples said. But Jesus, without this small-mindedness of his followers, instead had the disciples organize the people. And think of any time that you have been in the midst of a large crowd compared to a small group. In that small group, the chaos of being part of a numberless, faceless crowd gives way. We start to notice others. We can have conversations because we might even be able to hear one another. Freed from scarcity, freed from sending people away, Jesus is beginning to create the conditions where community can actually form among people. I might still be wondering, though, how does Parker Palmer account for all these people eating? They only had 5 loaves of bread and a couple of fish. How did they all eat if it wasn't magic or miracle? Palmer suggests the story may have unfolded like this. When Jesus took the bread, the little he had, and the 2 fish, and gave thanks, broke it, distributed it, he modeled sharing. He modeled generosity. And in these smaller groups of people where there wasn't the chaos of the crowd, people could see this unfolding. And as Jesus was generous, the people not only noticed their neighbors, they noticed, well, some of them had something too. In these smaller communities of people, those who had something began to share with those who did not. And Palmer writes, suddenly, through a community ignited by an example of generosity, scarcity turns into abundance. We still need our imagination inspired by this story, so that we never forget that examples of generosity are still the spark that can create beloved community, where scarcity can turn to abundance. Thanks be to God. Amen.